Well, it's time now for our regular Friday panel of parliamentary journalists. Jordan Press is with the Canadian Press and Brian Platt is with the National Post. Good to see you both.
Good afternoon.
Let's begin with what, of course, was really the big political story in Canadian politics that week. We've already been covering it on the show today, and that is, of course, the staying of the charge against Vice Admiral Mark Norman. And Brian, you covered this case closely. You've been at the courthouse for all the pre-trial motions, for all the disputes over producing information, over testimony. So having sat through all that over the past few months, what do you still see as the biggest unanswered question as we now move forward?
Well, the biggest question is what Vice Admiral Mark Norman decides to do. We know that he feels that this was an unfair prosecution. He and his lawyers feel this was an unfair prosecution from the very beginning, that he was unfairly targeted, and that the government, this is an argument his lawyers made over and over again in court, that the government was making it as hard as possible for him to defend himself. So we'll see where things go now with him in the military and how he fits back in. And I mean, there's somebody else in the job that he used to have, so I don't know how that's going to work out. I think that this story is still far from over when it comes to how Vice Admiral Norman and the government come to terms about what happened.
Jordan, what sticks out to you?
Well, it just picking up on that, it's the fact that really this isn't over. I mean, if you look back and think about another case similar to Mark Norman's, where the RCMP pursued someone, took him to court, and then suddenly the case falls apart, well, that's Mike Duffy. He's still in court suing the RCMP and the government, the Senate as well, to a lesser extent, but suing them over that investigation. So really, the story does not end. Mark Norman has said he wants to talk. He wants to explain what it is that happened to him so it doesn't happen again. That's a slow drip that this government does not want to have happen. They've seen what happens on a slow drip in the SNC-Lavalin affair, and it cost them in the polls. So here is another case where there may, again, be a very slow drip of information, or it may come in torrents closer to election time. And let's also not forget there is a separate case still before the courts involving the leak of this information in another public servant, where these documents may be tabled, may become public. There may be information that comes out that way. So inevitably, this government is still going to have to deal with this issue and still deal with what happened behind the scenes on this shipbuilding.
And Brian, because we have that ongoing court action, that was certainly cited by Mr. Norman's legal team and the Crown in talking about why they couldn't disclose some of the more specific reasons, some of this new information that came to light. But certainly all indications was that the defense team, reached out to former Conservative cabinet ministers and other potential witnesses that the RCMP and the Crown did not. Tell me a bit about, having covered the trial, how that played out and this week, and just tell me about how you kind of see that now in the light of the Crown basically essentially abandoning the case.
Well, there's so much information that the defense has in their possession that it would have been fascinating to see how that played out in court, not only in the trial itself, but there was an abuse of process motion that they were in the middle of preparing. And that was coming potentially at the end of May or the beginning of June, so it was imminent, really, as far as we can tell. And so they did their own investigation. They talked to what I understand was a lot of people from the last year of Stephen Harper's government, presented that information to the Crown, and that the Crown looked at that. It's still an extraordinary mystery why the RCMP never did that work in the first place. But so it caused the Crown to drop the case. So it's an interesting question what that information is. But they have all kinds of stuff. They've got text messages that they subpoenaed. They've got all these cabinet confidence documents that the judge reviewed and handed over. They saw all of this material. So the question is, if there's a lawsuit, I feel that it's very likely there'll be a lawsuit. How much of that is able to come back, and it may still enter the public realm at some point.
And Jordan, even if there's not a lawsuit, there's certainly still calls for an inquiry into, how that charge came to be. Now, the Prime Minister again today denied that there was any hint of political interference in this case, either from his own office, the PMO, or the government in general. But as Brian just listed, knowing all that we know about the documents that were and weren't provided and so on, can they credibly make that claim to the public and be believed.
Well, if you are not a fan of the Liberal government, and you're definitely not a fan of Justin Trudeau, you will look at everything in front of you and make those kind of causal connections to say, yeah, the government, as Marie Hennon, Mark Norman's lawyer, said, tip the scales of justice with their finger. And that's going to be the thing that dogs them. No matter how many times they say, no, we were not involved in this. No, we had no influence in the process. There is a separation between the prosecution and politicians. No matter how many times they say that, there will be enough people who say, well, listen, you stood in the way of getting these documents out. You stood in the way, for instance, in the SNC-Lavalin affair and tried to, as Jody Wilson-Raybould said, interfere in that. There are going to be questions about the separation between this government and the prosecution service, even though, as the prosecution service said, there was no influence, there was no communication, there was no discussion about how to proceed with Mark Norman's trial.
Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
It's another way beyond the political damage it did to the government, the SNC-Lavalin affair. This shows why that was an ongoing problem for this government, because they say, and I have not seen any evidence to suggest otherwise, that the Public Prosecution Service made the decision to charge Norman and made the decision to drop the case on its own without any inappropriate conversations happening with government officials. But the SNC-Lavalin affair showed that this government doesn't. The allegation was that they don't respect the independence of the Public Prosecution Service the way at least Jody Wilson-Raybould felt that they should. And so you can see now in the way that political rhetoric is flying over this Mark Norman case now, how that might be a thing that damages this government over and over again going forward.
And of course, the difference is with SNC-Lavalin, Jody Wilson-Raybould was recording conversations, and in this case, and I know it was a big issue in court, people not taking notes at all of their conversations, right? So, Jordan, can we put the two of the, when we're talking about SNC-Lavalin and the Norman case, can we put it in a bit of a context in terms of what the potential for lasting damages? Because certainly, this trial was expected to begin right before the federal campaign, and now, we're not going to have that, but we've talked about some of the other potential avenues that this story can stay in the news. So if we look ahead over the next few months as we head towards the autumn, do you see it continuing to simmer, I guess?
Short answer, yes. Longer answer is that this just feeds into the opposition. The opposition calls, particularly the Conservatives, and how they're trying to brand Justin Trudeau as, he's not as advertised. So he comes out and says, we are a rule of law country, but then behind the scenes, he's asking questions about SNC-Lavalin. And then there's the question about involvement in the Mark Norman trial. These are things that are going to dog the Liberals through the campaign, because the Conservatives and the NDP are going to make sure you hear about it over and over. And because of the damage that this government saw to its polling figures and its reputation in light of the SNC-Lavalin affair and in light of everything that kept coming out about it, this during a campaign would not be very good for them. So they need to come up with something much better in some way, a better communication strategy than saying, don't worry, everything's fine, we didn't get involved. There needs to be something a little better of a strategy to communicate that to the public if they want to make sure that it doesn't hurt them on election day.
Brian, how do you think the government should respond compared to how they've been handling it so far? That perhaps for them it doesn't drag on into the fall.
Well, it will depend, I think, partly on what Vice Admiral Mark Norman decides to do now. How he fits back in with the Canadian Forces, having gone through all of this, and whether he said at the press conference yesterday, I have a story that I want to tell. And so that seems like it's a lingering threat that's out there, potentially, for the government, is if he decides to tell that story, when he decides to tell it, how that plays out. So, I think a lot of what happens now will be up to how Vice Admiral Norman goes forward.
Well, certainly one story that the Liberal government does want to tell is today's job creation numbers, 107,000, blowing away what people had projected for this month. So, Jordan, that may perhaps deflect some of the heat from the government on this story, but, how much credit can the federal government take for this surge in jobs that we saw today?
And that's a good question, because it is a question every government faces. Because when things go well, governments always like to take credit for it. When things are not going so well, they usually blame something else. What we can say is that on the margins, governments can have an influence on jobs, they can have an influence on gross domestic product. But overall, the way you see this government communicating that is not saying, when, and particularly today when the Prime Minister was asked, do you take credit for it? He went back and said, here's what we've done since 2015. And essentially, here is our plan to help people create jobs. And that's a message you're going to hear. They don't say, we created the jobs. They'll say, we created the platform for other people, for the private sector, for Canadians to create those positions. So in a sense, they are taking credit for these numbers without actually saying, we are taking credit. Now, there are some other good figures to look at in these job numbers. Employment is up as well. You're talking not just the jobs themselves, but the employment rate, the number of job seekers is growing as well. Those are all good numbers for the Canadian economy. And so overall, it is positive for this government. It is something that they can carry forward. But we'll see if the economy starts going in a different direction, closer to election time. It is going to be harder for them to talk that away and saying, we've been able to make sure that the economy is humming, as opposed to what you're going to get from the Conservatives.
Yeah, because Brian, in the moment we have left, I just want to ask you about that point, because certainly economic management, taxes, the deficit, it's going to be a big part of the Conservative campaign this fall. So even though a lot of the economic outlook numbers are still a bit down for this year, you've got this big job number. So is this a good, very quickly, how does this help the Liberals beat
Well,
back
it
that?
gives the Liberals not even necessarily a shield, but a sword to use if things keep going in this direction. 1 month, monthly numbers are volatile, right? This was no doubt a very, very good number. But the year did seem to be starting off in the wrong direction for the government in terms of where everything was heading. You had people even talking, are we on the edge of heading into a recession right now? So to have a number like this is huge for the government. And now there's still enough time for things to go back in the wrong direction again. The long-term trends always matter, though, and it seems like maybe things are still overall going in the right direction for the government.
All right, thank you both.